These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Shamshi-Adad V is placed upon the Assyrian throne by the Babylonian king in 820 BCE, 2 years after he had claimed the throne. And in Shamshi-Adad we see both of the commonly accepted flaws of the hereditary monarchy form of government, the succession struggle, and the risk of getting stuck with a king who is a bum. We covered the succession crisis last episode, which does look to me like more than your ordinary civil war, but of course there's limited evidence to draw firm conclusions on the matter. But this episode I want to really focus on the fact that the Assyrian Empire has permanently changed. Shamshi-Adad is the 6th king since the start of our Neo-Assyrian revival, and to be honest, what the kingdom accomplished in the 125 years since Ashur-Dan II showed up is remarkable. And it's worth noting that for a king to go through 5 kings in 125 years and have every single one of them be notable for their competence, that's really an astonishing run of good luck that's quite rare in history. Which of course makes us wonder if it really is good luck, especially since Assyria will have a number of later kings who tend to exhibit basically the same fundamentally aggressive and pragmatic qualities that have brought the empire so much success up to this point. Though the education and the culture of the court is largely obscure to us in the details, we can say with a fair degree of confidence that whatever they were doing, the kings and the courts of each generation were able to instill into their heirs a strong sense of the duties and responsibilities of an Assyrian king, and to educate them in the techniques involved. While each king is recognizably different in their approach, each is able to competently handle their nobles, their army, foreign policy, construction, and taxation, as well as, of course, the religious and ritual requirements of the position. Just as importantly, though, they were able to rely on a set of subordinates, the governors and administrators, drawn from the noble houses, who seem to have had a similarly rigorous cultural inculcation. For the entire early Neo-Assyrian period, the era upon which the sun has now set with the coronation of Shamshi-Adad, we have only a single reference in the literature of any nation which could even hint at decadence, and that would be the famous massive banquet of Ashurnasirpal II, and most people would rather call this a display intended to overawe, not a mere sign of decadence, given how massively psychotic Ashurnasirpal was. Nowadays, we look at a situation like this and we'll tend to say that, something must have been in the water. But the truth is that something was in the education system, including not just the formal schooling, but in the witness examples that the rising generation saw in their fathers and their fathers' peers. Assyrian men took their official posts seriously because, of course, those who didn't advance, and those who did were hailed as a model for future generations. We don't have any explicit texts that tell children to, be responsible and whatnot, but the official records which do survive provide something even more powerful than mere instruction. They provide examples. And just as we see ancient kings and administrators acting effectively and with minimal drama in all these texts, so too did the noble children educated on these texts and examples like it see their own role models as embodying Assyrian values in exactly this way. The adult generations lived their virtues so that the children could grow up inculcated in those virtues and then in turn live those virtues. It's a lesson for all times and places, but it's this why Shamshi-Adad is such a disappointment, and at the same time why the age of the Magnates into which we're now entering is actually less destructive than most people might assume from all the tales of courtly intrigue and power politics that we're going to be looking at in this and later episodes. When authority devolves, the vast majority of the Ma'asher largely carries on how it had been on a day-to-day level. And of course, there was surely an increase in palace drama. We'll see hints at it throughout this royal history, but we want to keep a proper perspective on all the events of this period. When an empire isn't growing, we often assume that it's stagnating or struggling. But for the next 80 years or so, Assyria enters into something of a period of quiescence, just peacefully getting by. Now, I mean, there will still be youths tossed into bonfires as their parents watch, slowly asphyxiating from the stakes that they've been impaled upon, but the expansive energy will be much reduced. But all that is by way of introduction. Shamshi-Adad was the puppet of his Turtan Yahalu for the first 8 years he was on the throne, and he seems to have been either a poor military leader himself, or he was very dependent upon generals who were of varying levels of competence. I would actually lean towards the former, that the king himself was defective in these early years for a number of reasons. Now, we don't have a year-by-year certain listing of his military campaigns. The summaries in his year lists don't always match his inscriptions, and even his inscriptions don't always quite match each other the way we'd like them to. But we do know he didn't lead his army out every year, and he may have actually been at the head of his army fewer than half of the years of his reign. This could suggest that things were too unstable at the center for him to venture out most years, especially in the early ones. Or it could be that, as a puppet, his puppet masters wanted military glory going to other people. Or it could just be that he was simply seen as inept and only trusted on the most minor of military expeditions. In terms of building, he built nothing, or at least so little as to be insignificant. He did expand the palace a bit, but as far as we can tell, it isn't clear that anything of insignificance got constructed, and he doesn't seem to have finished anything worth finishing either, as likely very little had gotten started during the Civil War era from his father's time for him to complete, or at least very little got done by the capital faction. It's an open question of whether Ashur-dan and Apli ever built anything worthwhile. Now, once his Turtan Yahalu died, a little more than halfway through his reign, Shamshi-Adad then did start to show a bit of initiative and got a handful of new temples started, but these wouldn't be finished in his own lifetime, and they get completed by his son. It is interesting that Puppet Master Yahalu did not start any construction, either in the king's name or in his own. But again, it could be that there was just too much inner-court politics to manage it, or perhaps the incentives just weren't aligned for a chief minister to do all this building in the way that they were for a king. Now, the one thing Shamshi-Adad did do that we can credit him for is that he definitely undertook the religious obligations of a king. And we shouldn't underestimate this. During the enthroning ceremony, he was, as all his fathers and forefathers before him had been, primarily given the paired titles of Shangu and Re'u, meaning master of Ashur's temple and shepherd of Ashur's people. Kingship being something which flows from these responsibilities. And in the most traditional of documents, it's typically acknowledged that Ashur himself is the king, with the earthly lord of the empire merely acting as his steward. Now, that mere stewardship has eroded into full kingship in all practical senses by this point, but there is something significant in how one defines kingship in a nation that appears to have genuine implications to how a succession crisis plays out. Because on the one hand, the Addasside dynasty, of which Shamshi-Adad is a member, is by now very close to 1,000 years old, an unbroken line of rulership that would itself have been a very powerful force in the highly traditional Assyrian government, regardless of the merits of any individual king. On the other hand, shepherd and priest are duties that a puppet can execute satisfactorily. The administration of the government was always being handed off to subordinates to one degree or another. This period of time just saw a rather more radical authority handoff than normal. But of course, just because someone other than the king is in charge doesn't necessarily mean that that person is doing a bad job of things. The 8 years of the Yahalu administration are overall not disastrous. One imagines that there's quite a lot of politicking involved in reuniting a nation, especially when you are a minority party propped up by a foreign power, but Yahalu seems to manage it. The governors who had followed Ashur-Daninapli fall back into line, and some former members of the palace circle who had joined the enemy are brought back in, such as Rabshakeh Ashur-Buniah-Usur, who I did mention last episode as either having defected or died, but that was actually a miss on my part, as he clearly isn't dead and gets returned to government a few years after the Civil War, and was even honored as Limu official for the year 816, attesting to his great political significance among the great houses of the Assyrians. The kings of prior eras had assumed this sort of internal state building could only be accomplished through the vessel of the king as regent of Ashur, as confirmed by the king as victorious conqueror. But here Yahalu is proving that the people can be brought together without a great central figure. But of course, conquest is still happening. This is still Assyria, even if in a far more desultory fashion than in prior generations. His first campaign, or the first one that Shamshi-Adad takes credit for, is against the remnants of the Nairi. Not, note you, the rising and credible power of Urartu, but the scattered South Armenian hill tribes of the Nairi, who are at this point squeezed totally between Ashur and Urartu, and at this point wholly unable to put up any significant resistance. They resist so little, and have so little, in fact, that Shamshi-Adad is unable to boast of any significant plunder, or even of significant fighting and heroism on his part. And of course, some of this is because he made an absolute hash of this campaign, and he was only able to claim any sort of victory at all through significant distortion of the truth. This is where you pick the local football team to play against your real big football team for the first game of the year, so that your big school football team has the win to start the season off, and then the little team comes in and just carries away with it. We have no sense of the chronology of any of these campaigns, so we can't tell if this campaign was part of the efforts to bring former rebels back on side by, going out and winning one for the team, or if this came after the pieces of the Civil War had all been picked up. But either way, even such a small war as this was a ritual responsibility of the king, and Shamshi-Adad himself seems to have relished even this fight, even though it wasn't actually a victory or anything to brag about, but he's so pumped that he dedicates the so-called victory to all four of the great gods, Ashur, Shamash, Adad, and Ishtar. The next campaign, which we assume was in the following year, though we can't really tell with the chronology, the puppet masters didn't even let Shamshi-Adad out of the palace, instead dispatching a eunuch general named Mataris Ashur back to the same geographic area as last time to fight the remnants of the Nairi who had so shamed the king the previous year. This time, in the hands of some competent leadership, the army is able to sweep through the area, destroy a bunch of villages, take a bunch of plunder, and, crucially for Shamshi-Adad, take all of their gods. Shamshi-Adad is another seemingly very pious king, though he leans rather more towards piety directed to the most warlike aspects of his traditional pantheon. Thus far, he's kept in check, or more like he's kept in his cage, by his advisors who are convinced that he's an absolute moron. But we've got to assume that this is only causing the rage in his soul to bubble ever stronger beneath his lid. At some point, however, the king got his hands on the full, actual army and was able to rampage wherever he wanted. It isn't quite clear when this happened, though it was probably while Yahalu the Turtan still lived, indicating perhaps that over time the king was in fact able to get a bit of control for himself. It may also be the case that Marduk Zakir Shumi over in Babylon has passed away, though we don't actually know the date of his passing for certain, only that it must have occurred sometime between 823, which is our last certain time that we know he was alive, and 813, which is our first mention of his successor being king. Another possibility is that the army just took this long to either recover from the civil war or had needed to stay near to home to help calm any lingering tensions and couldn't be spared on longer campaigns until this point. So we don't know what exactly has changed, whether the constraints on the king were any less, or if the king was simply overwhelmingly furious at this point, but the army is finally released to go on a grand adventure with the king at its head. Now, Shalmaneser, you'll remember, was a religious man, and we saw his piety in the construction of temples and the frequent observance of religious rites. Shamshi-Adad, meanwhile, is a religious man in that he believes himself to be channeling the god Ninurta through his body. He doesn't appear to take this to crazed extremes, and in his official documents he does acknowledge that he is not himself the hero god, but merely the god's vessel. And really, you can say that all Assyrian kings are, to some extent, divine ambassadors on the earth, so it isn't a conceptual change. But the point is that when he goes on this campaign, he dedicates himself very much to Ninurta, and portrays himself in full action hero mode. Yes, we saw similar violence and self-congratulation among Ashur-Nasirpal, but the focus here is much more on the king's great prowess. And it's a subtle thing, but we can definitely read at least a bit of the different kings' personalities in these official inscriptions. Just as we don't know the year that this third campaign began, we don't actually know if it was a single campaign. The general opinion among modern scholars seems to be that this wasn't one campaign, but many. It was a few different assaults in the same general direction, spread out among a few separate years. The itinerary in general seems to have been north and east into the mountains. He very much wants to fight the Nairi, and very much seems to hate them, a rage likely fueled by the fact that his first campaign went so poorly, and then he was shown up by his eunuch general. Since, there's no clear actual threat that the Nairi pose at this point, so the only reason he could be going back is something personal. But beyond the Nairi, something has drawn him east, and it might be a religious thing, but more on that in a bit. The actual eastward campaign is not particularly significant. He goes to area after area and either receives tribute and submission, or he gets to smash some heads in. In the smashing of heads, we regularly see divine assistance channeling through Shamshi-Adad during the victory. At one point, his mighty weapons burst forth with the aura of the god Ashur. Another time, he likened himself to a mighty eagle scaling a great mountain fastness. His personal brilliance struck enemies dead, and he thundered like the storm god Adad. The cities were plundered and destroyed, though Shamshi-Adad revels in the battles and in the destruction of the enemy, not in the atrocities committed against the populace, merely mentioning that, the defeated populace, they were slaughtered and or enslaved, but he doesn't go into the exhaustive details of war crimes that his father sometimes engaged in. Of course, the Assyrian army could well still have been sowing terror in that way, and the king simply chose not to highlight that in his records, but it's telling that he focuses on the violence against enemy soldiers most of all. The actual battles themselves were not significant in size. The biggest claim is that at one point he defeated 6,000 enemies, and a total of 3 pitched battles were in his entire eastward campaign, which again might have been spread out among multiple years. If it was a single campaign season, 3 pitched battles would have been pretty kind of significant, even if they weren't huge. But if these are spread among 2 to 4 years, as most historians think, it's just a thing. The one thing of note in all of this is the wild exaggeration in his claim of how many cities he's conquered. Now, we've been seeing this in Assyrian royal archives, that the victorious Assyrian king will claim that his army took tens or sometimes even hundreds of cities in a campaign, which we usually take as an estimate of how many tiny villages and farming communities were under the control of their enemies. And we often doubt that the army even bothered to visit many of these tiny farming communities, just claiming control over them because the central fortress had been taken. Because it was often not a matter of actual but theoretical control, sometimes these numbers of cities taken, again typically meaning little more than a farming community with 1 or a few families living around a watchtower, this number can kind of get inflated sometimes. With Shamshi-Adad, however, these inflations start to get a bit silly, entering the hundreds and thousands for relatively minor nations. It isn't clear whether Shamshi-Adad and his scribes genuinely thought that this was an appropriate estimate just because they weren't really familiar with the land they were entering this far east, or if they're inflating things because they think they can get away with it. Again, they're really far off in the east, and it'll boost the otherwise unremarkable king's image a bit. Now, the plunder from all this is significant. It's heavy on livestock, and they even take home some of the Central Asian 2-humped camels, which are a novelty back in Kalhu. This tribute was probably badly needed at this point, both to offset the losses of the revolt period, but also because the Assyrian government has continued to fail to enforce their tribute demands on the Syrian nations and the defeated Urartians, and over the 17 years of the revolt and then Shamshi-Adad's kingship, these formerly subjugated nations are going to slowly and quietly reduce or wholly neglect to send tribute on a regular basis. Some still would, for sure, hoping that it would ensure some level of protection for them, maybe protection against their enemies in the local area, or just, the kind of mafia-style protection against the Assyrian army when they inevitably do return to the region. But each year, the relative quiet of Assyria was more and more noticeable for other kingdoms, leading to an increasing number of Western kings to quietly neglect their obligations. If Shamshi-Adad had noticed any of this, he didn't take any action, either because of his lack of confidence in his own ability to win against these more powerful enemies, or just because of courtly politics. Now in 814, the political situation had finally changed. Things remain, as usual, fairly obscure, but Yahalu finally died, and at the same time the Babylonian king Marduk-Zakir-Shumi, who had dominated the southern region for perhaps 3 decades at this point, also passed away. The two appear to have been the main constraints on Shamshi-Adad's actions, and it seems to have been deeply resented by the man who more and more viewed himself as an agent of the gods. Of course, for all that he resented it, he apparently lacked the wisdom or ability to prevent it from continually recurring in his court, as we do see the highly influential actions of Governor Nergal-Eliah, and in Mayor of Ashur Ili-Itia, and in royal wife Shammu-Ramat starting to emerge by this point. I mean, we can't see what exactly they're doing, and we can't be sure that there weren't more significant actors, but the fact that we can name these three underlings as being significant in the royal record, which is typically so focused on the kings, is again the mark of a sea change in Assyrian internal politics. Of these three, we know that Ili-Itia was a eunuch, Shammu-Ramat was a woman, and we don't know the status of Nergal-Eliah's genitals, but it is yet another signpost of how the introduction of eunuchs, originally intended to cut the power of the administrative class, has accomplished nothing of the sort, as the kings have wrongly felt that it was safer to entrust more power to these beardless men. The lesson for history is that it is apparently quite difficult to not entrust huge amounts of power to what the kids are nowadays calling the deep state, as the value of having competent career bureaucrats is very easy to express, but the risk of entrusting them with tremendous and poorly overseen authority are much harder to quantify until you suddenly find yourself deep into a sea change of governing style. 814, then, is the most significant year of Shamshi-Adad's reign, and yet what exactly happened in that year and its implications are basically impossible to tease out. Bel-Lu-Balat becomes the Turtan, and we do have a pair of inscriptions surviving from his 5-year tenure in the office, though neither tells us much about his accomplishments or influence, just that he was around. At the same time, the Limu list tells us that the great god went to Dur, something that we'd seen in Shalmaneser's reign and will see twice more in Assyrian history. The exact significance and nature of this act is unclear. I mean, it's clearly something religiously relating to the great religious city of Dur, and may have been some sort of parade, but in this case we also know that Shamshi-Adad, in this case, is actually attacking Dur, laying siege and overwhelming the city, taking back basically the entire population of the city as captives on orders from the god Ashur. Curiously, this campaign does not show up in the main royal annals, being mentioned primarily in the religious records. But this religious record is also pretty interesting. It's been regular practice for kings to send letters to the god Ashur after the annual campaign, just to keep the great god informed on earthly matters, and so that the king would get some divine approval. I mean, people speaking to gods is a very common occurrence in history, but for the god to talk back is a much rarer and more remarkable phenomenon. In this case, we have a fragmentary letter from the god Ashur to Shamshi-Adad, something that must have deeply flattered his piety. The contents of the letter are pretty unremarkable, the parts that we can read simply confirming that Ashur was, in fact, the great god who was responsible for Shamshi-Adad's victories in various places, including his campaign in Dur and his campaigns in the east. But the fact that this letter exists at all, even without having most of it, is pretty neat, raising as it does the possibility that Shamshi-Adad's strings were also being pulled from within the temple, not just the palace. Another note of interest around religion is that around this time we start to hear about royal patronage of a goddess named Belat Parsi, whose very name is ambiguous. It could mean the Lady of Cults, indicating some goddess whose domain is temples and religious ceremonies, or it could be an Akkadianization of the goddess of the Parsua, the tribes who will later become the Great Persian Empire and who are now starting to become a major force, along with the Medes, in the Iranian mountains, a trade partner and a war victim of the Assyrian Empire at this point. But Shamshi-Adad has spent a lot of time in the east by now, so this eastern explanation isn't wholly baseless. He may have, if not gone native, at least picked up a little bit more from the east than just a bunch of plunder and slaves. His son, Adad-Nirari III, will also venerate this goddess, and then we will hear no more from her in the historical record, so she's clearly tied to something going on at this particular time. And all of that brings our attention to Shammu-Ramat, the primary wife of Shamshi-Adad. And she is the famous Semiramis of Greek mythology, or at least she is the historical kernel, which has grown into something quite much more legendary and fantastical, as we'll see next episode, when the legends kind of grew to pretty far outstrip the actual historical figure of Shammu-Ramat. Still, this historical queen is someone worthy of note in her own right. She's the one and only woman in all of Assyrian history to wield any amount of political authority, never ruling in her own right, but serving for perhaps 5 years as regent over her son Adad-Nirari. We expect that a woman who could manage that was likely among the shadow realm of powers behind the throne, even under her husband Shamshi-Adad, and Belat Parsi might be closely tied to that. Whether Belat Parsi is an Eastern goddess or a local minor goddess, the chronological coincidence of this goddess during the age of Shammu-Ramat leads to the natural inference that the royal house was devoted to this goddess because she was introduced by Shammu-Ramat herself, and the goddess returned again to obscurity after the royal queen's star faded. All of this brings us to the question of where Shammu-Ramat herself came from, and that is unknown. The two leading theories are that she was a Babylonian princess married to Shamshi-Adad on the occasion of his humiliating Babylonian treaty, and her unusual independence and power was originally based on her status as a woman as an agent of Babylon in Assyria. The other theory is that she was an Eastern woman. Some say maybe even a slave or captive princess brought in during one of the Eastern campaigns. Her name, Shammu-Ramat, means either that the god Shammu is exalted or that the god is beloved. But who exactly Shammu is, and whether or not this is just another name for Belat Parsi, is unknown. Whatever her origin, she soon becomes the primary wife, either out of power politics or tugging on the puppet king's heartstrings. And it will be her firstborn son, Adad-Nirari, who becomes the heir apparent quite quickly. We'll look at her more powerful era when we get to Adad-Nirari's reign, but it isn't quite what the legends would suggest, amounting more to an interesting footnote than a great world historic figure. Meanwhile, Shamshi-Adad is an extremely angry man who believes himself to be specially chosen of the gods. Not, I think you'll agree, a very stable or healthy combination. And his anger for nearly 10 years now has been focused on Babylon, a nation which he's only now ready to take head on. Not only is the new king new down in Babylon and untested, but Shamshi-Adad has finally figured out how to manage his army thanks to these eastern campaigns and can now lead it kind of successfully. Either he or his advisors come up with a fairly clever scheme to bypass the Babylonian fortresses and garrisons along the Tigris and Euphrates. The army sets out eastward rather than south, following the Zab River, and then goes across the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. After setting out, the king comes across 3 lions and is able to kill them, which is viewed by all as something of a good omen and a symbol of the king's divine favor. The army then heads south until arriving in the land of Akkad from an unexpected direction, and falls upon the fortress city of Dur-Papskal like a plague of locusts, overcoming 13,000 defenders and showing no mercy against the people, as if the regular people of Babylonia were somehow responsible for the former Babylonian king humiliating the Assyrian puppet. Shamshi-Adad burns the city to the ground after a thorough pillaging, then advances probably some distance along one of the Diyala River tributaries until the Babylonian army is able to recover from the shock and muster the troops eastward. Marduk-Balattu-Ikbi, the son of the great Marduk-Zakir-Shumi, is able to call upon armies from Babylonia as well as allied contingents from the Chaldeans, Aramaeans, Elamites, and Namri, and the resultant army simply overwhelms the Assyrians. However, during the rout of the defeat, Shamshi-Adad is able to lead a segment of his army around the main battle to the Babylonian royal tent in the back lines, and during his retreat he's able to carry off Marduk-Balattu-Ikbi and some of his royal bodyguard and attendants. The battle was a loss, ending the campaign for the year, but the enraged Shamshi-Adad was able to vent at least some of his frustration on the very flesh of his captives, publicly and apparently personally flaying them all alive in a public ceremony in the middle of Nineveh. Battle in the following year was basically guaranteed at this point, and the new Babylonian king, Baba-Aha-Idna, who may not have even been in the royal line, but rather just the most senior official able and willing to take charge of the great national emergency, assembled the southern army as Shamshi-Adad called out to the people of Mat-Asher. Again, the Assyrians took the less defended eastern route, entering at the minor town of Nibu and confronting the enemy there. Most of the Babylonian army would have been intact after last year's victory, though we don't hear about whether the allies were with him this time. The battle was a full-out siege assault with rams and tunnels and ladders, and the Assyrian army was this time able to breach and unleash their fury on the town. Baba-Aha-Idna was taken alive, though surely he didn't remain that way for very long, and the Assyrian army was unleashed to spend months, apparently unopposed, absolutely decimating the entire land of Babylonia, entering and annihilating 7 major cities in the north and east, then going into the Babylonian heartland to enslave and plunder the nation that had now been reduced to absolute chaos. The gods of southern Mesopotamia, ancient and revered, were stolen in large numbers and taken north, and Shamshi-Adad did manage near the end of the year to calm down enough to undertake a religious pilgrimage to the temples at Cuthah, Babylon, and Borsippa, emulating his father in a bloody farce of Shalmaneser's far more pious entry into the region. These 3 years of battle, and especially the absolutely ferocious decimation at the end of the 3rd year, took Babylon from being a great power over all the neighboring regions, including Assyria itself, to only a few years later being so destroyed that the very history of Babylonia will seem to be ended for about the next century. The city and region has not been so thoroughly annihilated since the great disaster that concluded Hammurabi's dynasty had culminated in the Hittite sack of Babylon in 1595 BCE. And this is going to lay the foundations for the Chaldean entry into Babylonia proper, as at the end of this campaign, as a reward for not having joined the Babylonian army this time, Shamshi-Adad is going to go down to the Chaldean lands in the swamps and make a sort of peace with them and say, hey, we can get along. And so they're going to be able to slowly take over, or perhaps even not so slowly, we just don't know what was going on at this point in time. The Chaldeans are going to take over Babylonia so thoroughly that Babylon itself is going to become synonymous with the Chaldeans. But of course, that's all in the future. All of this 5-year shift from greatest power in the Near East to absolutely devastated comes about because Marduk Zakir Shumi had grown a bit too prideful and insulted the wrong young puppet. Shamshi-Adad was not a competent king, nor was he a terribly accomplished one, but he carried within him a fury sufficient to shake heaven and earth. And then he died. We don't know why he died, if it was natural causes or internal intrigue or the consequences of his destruction of Babylonia, or if he simply expired upon the satisfaction of his vengeance like the anti-hero of a Korean revenge movie. But he died so suddenly that none of his great annals had yet been completed, and most sit unfinished even to this day, as if the engraver had simply put down his chisel part way through the job upon hearing that the commissioning king had passed away. He was survived by a son who was, at most, 13 years old, and a gaggle of courtly plotters, each scheming to take advantage of the nearly unprecedented circumstance of an underage heir in the coming regency. The story of that regency and the remarkable puppet reign of Adad-Nirari III will be our next stop on the great train of history. But next time we won't actually be looking at that. Instead, I want to pause and take a look at his mother, the somewhat significant Shammu-Ramat, who would somehow become an object of fascination for Greek historians in the classical era, and have her legend magnified all out of proportion in the myth of Queen Semiramis. I think a lot of people have vaguely heard of Queen Semiramis, but I want to now spend the whole of next episode on really understanding just how bafflingly absurd it is, partly for some historical context and partly because it's just going to be some extremely campy fun. So join us next time as we discover that, as far as the Greeks were concerned, the Assyrians never had any worthwhile kings. The Persian Empire wasn't actually all that great, and Babylon was just a Johnny-come-lately vanity project with no true antiquity behind it. Thank you for listening.